Welcome, everybody. We are studying the life of Elijah the prophet. This is our third week looking at this. Our last session or installment I called Preparing for a Showdown. This two-part session I'm calling More Training for a Showdown. So there's part 1 and part 2, and you're in part 1 right now. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 17. Looked at Elijah's story up to verse 10. You'll recall Elijah told King Ahab, you're going to have no rain, you're going to have a drought until I say so. And then right after that, God then spoke to Elijah telling him to go east and hide in the Kerith ravine. Maybe for protection, maybe for time for training and preparation. Definitely a good time to show some important truths to Elijah about God. So Elijah drinks from the brook and the ravens feed him, and then this happens. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. So God's plan didn't amount to Elijah staying by the brook forever. God had work for him to do. It was time to move on. In the same way, God may change your circumstances because you're ready or he's ready for the next step in the big picture. So Elijah was told to go to a town called Zarephath, a bigger deal than you might think. At least 90 miles away. I have a map here. Remember, this is through the drought. And looking at the map, he's here and has to go all the way up here. Remember that King Ahab and Jezebel are looking for him. And here he has to pass through Israel to get up there. It's Baal country. And remember, that's where Jezebel came from. It'll be further proof who's more powerful, God or Baal. You might think of it as a perfect hiding place if you can get there, because you wouldn't think he'd be there if he can make it. So Elijah obediently makes the long walk through the drought. He eventually makes it to the city. I don't know how long that would take to walk 90 miles. You guys can do the math. I imagine he's thinking, how will I know which widow God arranged for me to meet? On the bright side, I also would think that Elijah was thinking it's good to know God's a step ahead in the plan. Let's read on in the story. The second half of verse 10 and on from there. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Ooh, that's pretty serious. It looks like maybe Elijah had a little test plan. Bring me water, bring me some bread. Remember, it's a drought, water is scarce, wheat isn't growing. He meets a widow, but look at her circumstances. A starving widow with a hungry boy to take care of. So impoverished a widow that she's preparing her last meal. This sounds like a person who has lost all hope. Talk about learning about God. God will accomplish his purposes, not just however and with whatever he chooses, but whomever he chooses. This woman, she wasn't a Jew, she was a Gentile. She was a widow, and remember, you can imagine they were usually poor. Widows normally ran out of food first in a famine. I wonder, did it cross Elijah's mind that he played a part in the widow's circumstances? Indirectly by saying there will be no more rain. Let's think about first impressions. This woman needs his help, not someone to provide for him. I wonder if he's thinking, maybe this is the wrong widow. or even thinking maybe I ought to go back to the brook. At least I knew what was going on there. Maybe I need to find another hiding place. He does none of that. He stayed where God told him to stay. He seems to be facing a test of faith, but Elijah's eyes were on the God who provides. The brook and ravens went a long way to build up trust in God. I think of us as we build up trust. We might not have anything as significant as ravens feeding us every day, or a brook during a famine. But think back of the little things that kind of add up to build up our trust. Now let's think of the widow. The widow is certainly getting a test of faith too. Imagine if you were her. This stranger has the audacity to ask for water in a drought. And given her circumstances, he asked for bread. It would take faith to avoid knocking him on the head with one of her sticks. Let's read on. Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said." I wonder if that means go ahead and have your last meal and go ahead and die. Go home and do as you have said. I guess make the meal. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have, and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land. So Elijah calmed her fears of himself, her hunger, her imminent death. How could he do this? How could he say, "Don't be afraid"? Well, because he knew from personal experience, not second-hand stories, that God comes through when he says he will. He stuck with his request to feed him first and then feed herself. But he also gave her a promise. On the authority of the word of God, she would have food until the drought ended. And how did the widow respond to this? Continuing on in verse 15, she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So the widow responded with the faith Elijah was hoping for. She went away and did as Elijah told her. Her obedient response demonstrated her faith in the word of the Lord. The Lord honored her faith by fulfilling his promise. Imagine it. She went to her kitchen, looked in the bowl, and there was flour. She looked into the jar, and there was found oil. Every morning and every evening, day after day, there it was. She witnesses God's providing. Day after day, she witnessed a God who cared for the poor and vulnerable. And day after day, she witnessed a true prophet of the living God. That was Elijah. The Lord also showed who the true God was once again. Remember how Baal, I've talked about in the past, was the nature god, the fertility god? Yet he didn't control the rains, the true God does. Where do you get bread? Well, from wheat, which doesn't do well in a drought. Where do you get oil? And that's from the olive trees. They don't do well in a drought. Only the true God could provide flour and oil in a drought. So a few lessons I want to bring out that apply to today. Besides another illustration of how God provides, I'd like to say that God's leading may be surprising, but go ahead and do it. If God says go to Zarephath, then go, whether you can make sense of it or not. If he says stay, even if it's difficult, do that too. Of course, that's easier said than done. Fear, our own agendas, all kinds of reasons get in the way, but we can try. If he says a starving widow will provide for you, you can bank on it. We are finite. God is infinite. He sees the whole picture. We just see glimpses. And think about waiting out your first impressions. That's exactly what they are, first impressions. That poor widow or crazy man asking for bread and water may not be ideal. When God is in the mix, first impressions can be deceiving. God's plan isn't guaranteed to be knock you over the head obvious. And then I want to say that God's promises often hinge on obedience. Elijah was told to arise, go, and then stay. The widow was told to go and make Elijah a little bread cake first. What if Elijah had not gone to the widow or hightailed it out? What if the widow hadn't been obedient and therefore not kept Elijah alive? Then the showdown that we're leading toward would not have occurred. Now I'm confident God would have accomplished his purposes, but he would have had to do it differently. But our obedience is very valuable and important. So Elijah's story with the widow will continue in part 2. I'm going to stop right here and take yourself a little break and then get to part 2.